Good afternoon and welcome to the June meeting for the Laguna Woods Democratic Club. My name is Susan Deering and I'm the vice president of the club. Our president, Linda Nearing, could not be with us today because of technical problems. Thank you to those of you who are with us on this Zoom call today, which is our first open meeting. And everyone will have their microphones muted. We will be taking questions, which you can submit in the chat function. And we are very happy today to have as our speaker, Susie Shannon. Susie is a health commissioner for the city of Los Angeles. She has also been a member of the Democratic National Committee since 2016. And she is an anti-poverty activist. And I will now call on Susie to take over, and she will tell you a lot more about herself and a lot more about the DNC. Thank you so much to everyone who is here with us today, and thank you to Susie for being our speaker.
Great, thank you so much. So first I want to thank the Laguna Woods Democratic Club for inviting me to speak, and to thank Susan and Lindsay and Jonathan for all of their hard work. I think that your club does a fantastic job. I spoke in person a few years ago at the club, and you guys are very active and doing a wonderful job. So I am a member of the Democratic National Committee. I just got reelected for another 4 years. I started in 2016 and was elected as the only Bernie Sanders delegate to come from the state of California. And my journey into the Democratic Party really started through my work on homelessness and poverty issues. And in 2005, someone that I knew who was a delegate, and back then, you know, we didn't really have a comprehensive website. People didn't know about the ADEMS meetings, you know, where you could go and get elected to represent the state of California, the Democratic Party. And so someone had just slipped me a copy of the platform. And when I looked through it, there was nothing in there on poverty issues. And so it was about 3 days before the state convention. And I sort of just naively wrote up, you know, what I wanted to see in the platform. And I brought it to the convention, and I asked somebody, like, how do I get this into the platform? Because I really feel like poverty issues are missing here, and that people from low-income communities are not represented. And so I was told that I needed to get about 300 signatures, and I said, well, how many delegates are there? And they said about 3,000. So I was an organizer, and I thought, well, this should be fairly easy. And so we just started collecting signatures, and people came over. A few people tried to intimidate me and basically say, you know, they weren't going to vote for it in the platform committee. And I know that one person asked me, like, why I'd missed the deadline to submit it. But back then you didn't have deadlines, you know, on the website, so nobody ever knew there was a deadline. And so I sort of, you know, made my way through this process, and then somebody came up to me and told me, you know, the chair of the platform committee would like you to testify at the hearing. And I was like, there's a hearing? I didn't even know there was a hearing. So I went and I testified, and we were able to get a poverty subplank into the platform for the California Democratic Party for the first time in history. And at that point, I realized that I really needed to be in the space. So I ran in 2007 to be a delegate and an executive board member. And then in the context of working at the California Democratic Party level, I worked hard to put marriage equality into the platform, passed a lot of resolutions, you know, on Medicare for all, single payer health care, a lot of environmental and climate justice issues, climate change issues, our anti-fracking resolution. And so I've been, you know, pretty much I've been a fairly consistent progressive activist within the California Democratic Party. And then in 2016, I decided to run for the DNC and won. And then while at the DNC, sort of a similar thing happened, which is where it became apparently, clear that we were not really working on poverty issues at the national level. And so I had put in a few resolutions before then on homelessness and a few other issues related to the LGBT community. And so I put in a resolution at the DNC level to create a poverty council. And the reason that I tell this story really is to understand sort of how it really works on the inside. So I put in my resolution, and I immediately got a call from staff saying that they didn't want a poverty council. They were willing to change the resolution to say we were reaffirming our commitment to poverty issues. And of course, my response to that was, well, I've been here, for at least a year and a half, and we really have not been working on these issues. And when you create a council, the way that the DNC is structured, we have councils and caucuses. But when you have either a council or a caucus, which is very specific either to an issue or to a demographic, right? So we have a disabilities council, we have an interfaith council, so we have a number of councils, but it does guarantee that you are addressing that issue at every single meeting. I actually rejected the staff's recommendation to change the resolution, and I basically said we need a poverty council, and I don't agree to change the resolution. They ended up changing it anyway and sending out a resolution on a reaffirmation, and I wrote a very strongly worded letter basically asking them to restore my language, which they did, and I spent the next couple of months, really the next month, because it was about 4 weeks away from the meeting, just organizing the DNC members. We had about 447 members at that time, representing all 50 states and our territories, in addition to that. And so I knew that I had the votes on the floor, but when I showed up at the Chicago DNC meeting, I went to talk to one of the co-chairs of our resolutions committee, and he told me in no uncertain terms that they were going to table the resolution. And so I spoke directly to Tom Perez, who is the chair of the DNC, and said, look, when you called me when you were running, I did end up, supporting his opponent, Keith Ellison. But I said, look, when you called me, you told me that you cared about homelessness, told me that you cared about poverty issues. And after speaking with me, he agreed to support the Poverty Council. And so it was unanimously voted on in the Resolutions Committee and then on the floor of the DNC. So at that point, we were celebrating and very happy. And I started to get to work on the following meeting where we would have our inaugural meeting for the Poverty Council. And I kept calling the staff to find out where our meeting was going to be, because we don't know. Usually, it's different places throughout the country, and I suppose sometimes in the territories. It hasn't been any of the territories since I've been a DNC member, but we did end up having it in Chicago, and I was called a day before the agenda went out, and they left a message on my voicemail telling me that they were not going to agendize our Poverty Council. So even though we unanimously voted to have it, we still had another hurdle here, which was to be put on the agenda and be given a room where we could meet. So what I did was I just called the hotel the next day, and I booked my own meeting room. And I, we had already touched base with a lot of congressional representatives, with a lot of stakeholders in Washington, D.C. who work on poverty issues, with a lot of activists in the area surrounding Washington, D.C. and people in Virginia. And so we had our meeting anyway, and people came from all over the United States. They came from, different parts. There's a whole busload of folks, actually 2 busloads of people who were bussed in from one of the homeless shelters in Virginia. We had one of the mayors from one of the cities in Virginia speak. Congresswoman Maxine Waters spoke. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. So we had, and the room was packed. It was just completely packed. And so I tell this story really to illustrate that sometimes, we feel like things are stacked against us, or that it's very hard to make change. And I think part of that is that, number one, you don't necessarily need to take no for an answer. And sometimes you need to show people what can be done in order to make things happen. And so, despite the fact that several barriers were put in our way, we were able to move forward with this, and we now have a poverty council. Our last meeting was in San Francisco. They did give us a room. They did agendize us. Tom Perez was very gracious and had arranged for Reverend Barber to come and speak at our poverty council. And I would say at this point, it's very, very much embraced now by the Democratic National Committee. And so I think, both at the California Democratic Party level and at the DNC level, there are opportunities for change, but you do need people who are willing to speak up for that change, and also to find a way forward, whether that's like, going as far as I did, which is, booking my own room in a hotel to make sure that a meeting's happening, or that we're not sort of cast aside, or these issues are not cast aside. Or it's moving for changes in our platform as we move forward toward the convention. All of these things, it's very important to have, people who are willing to champion issues that we care about. My belief is that we are part of the Democratic Party because we have certain principles and beliefs that we want to level the playing field, that we want to make sure that people have a voice. We want to make sure that the 40.3 million people living at or below the poverty level have a home within our party. We want to make sure that senior issues are addressed, that Social Security is secure, that Medicare is secure. And there are just certain things, choice, immigration issues, all of these things. We just want to make sure that these issues are addressed, and that we have just a basic foundation of beliefs that we are moving toward. And sometimes things get lost in the way with bylaws changes and rules changes and things that are going on, and people get confused, and sometimes they tune out. But I think as long as we're adhering to some of these basic principles, and that you have champions willing to do this, it's a reason to stay engaged in our party. And to stay active. So a lot of folks are aware that we do have a convention coming up. It was supposed to be in July in Milwaukee. We've moved the convention date to August 17th to the 20th. It is unclear right now, actually, how that actual convention will take place. We are voting now. We're in the process. Actually, today is the deadline for us to vote on giving the DNC the power to have a virtual convention, a partial virtual convention, to change the date, to change the venue, all of these things. I'm guessing that we will vote to do that, just to keep people safe during this COVID-19 pandemic. Because you don't really want 50,000 people descending on a city and potentially putting the residents of that city at risk, along with other delegates who are coming from all over the country. How that's going to shape up, we don't know. So there are, for the convention, 3 very important committees that will be meeting and working. They will obviously likely be meeting in a virtual environment, but again, we have not been told yet exactly how that's going to work. So there are 3 basic committees, which is the platform committee, the rules committee, and the credentials committee. And Tom Perez, who's our chair, has made all of his appointments to those committees as of right now. And then based on a proportion of the votes that our presidential candidates got, they also get appointees to those committees. So everyone's voice, for the most part, should be heard in those committees. The presidential candidate with the most delegates will have the most say in those committees, obviously, because they'll have more appointments than the other presidential candidates. But what is very promising, which many of you may have seen, was that Bernie Sanders' campaign and Biden's campaign did get together and create policy task forces. And I think that this is extremely important because this is a precursor to our platform. And it also sort of sets the stage for some of the priorities that we're going to see at the convention. And so for this policy task force, there are various committees. There is a climate change committee, a criminal justice committee, a committee on the economy, a committee on education, committee on healthcare, and a committee on immigration. And so there are, again, people have been appointed from both the Sanders campaign and the Biden campaign. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is on one of the committees. The Sunrise Movement is represented. AFL-CIO is represented. So you have, labor. So we have many of the important voices, within our Democratic family that are all going to have say in terms of these committees and what the priorities will be, and that will help inform the platform. And I think that's really important because, sometimes we can get into these sort of knockdown, drag-out fights over a lot of platform issues, which is fine and it's necessary. And sometimes we end up getting, really important changes. But I think starting now is really important so that we can go into the convention fairly unified. So I'll explain too, because there will probably be a lot of focus more on the platform than on the credentials or rules. There may be some on rules, there may be some changes that we're looking at within the convention, but for the most part, a lot of the speeches will be set the stage a lot for what's coming out in the platform in terms of issues that we'll be talking about. And so the way that the platform works is that the platform committee will vote on the platform, but there also can be what's called a minority platform that's brought forward with minority planks. And that's where you don't have enough votes, obviously, to get into the actual platform. But they may be issues that are controversial or that people feel are sort of a dissenting opinion, but also something very important to focus on as we're coming forward. So what I'd like to do, actually, Lindsay has, there's two very short videos that I'd like to show. And this goes all the way back to 1948. And in 1948, there was a very contentious convention, and there was a huge fight over civil rights. And our Southern delegation was very against civil rights legislation. Truman had tried to get Congress to pass some kind of civil rights legislation in February before our July convention, and had failed. And it wasn't specific in terms of what he had wanted from Congress. In 1948, there was a platform that was brought forward. And then there was also a minority plank on civil rights, which meant that, the platform committee didn't want to bring forward a lot of the civil rights issues that were coming up because there was a concern that the Southern delegation was not going to support it and it would split the convention. So what was brought forward, and it was really by Hubert Humphrey, were three things. The most important of which was desegregation of the military. The desegregation of the military anti-lynching law, or part of the platform, and then ending the poll tax. And so that was extremely controversial back in 1948. And thankfully, there was this minority plank that was brought forward. There was a huge march on the floor of the convention. People were not going to leave until this was passed. It was passed in the platform. They did vote on the minority plank, and the delegation, the entire delegation, voted and had the majority of the vote. And then the Southern delegation, I know for sure Mississippi and Alabama, walked out. And then a few months later, they had their own convention, which was called the Dixiecrats Convention. But I think what's important to note here, and this is something that I've done, which is to go back and look at the platforms, the Democratic Party platforms at the national level, which pass every 4 years. What's important to note here is that 2 weeks after that convention, Truman signed into law desegregation of the military. And we can see this sort of throughout history, that the Democratic Party platform has either been the impetus for legislation passing, or has been sort of happening at the time that legislation is moving. And we can see this also in 2012 too, with the introduction of marriage equality into the platform. So I had helped run like the grassroots movement at the California Democratic Party level on marriage equality. So we were all very excited when it was for the first time going to be in our platform in 2012. And it was really like Obama had, President Obama, had started off, just supporting civil unions and not supporting marriage equality. And there was a lot of pushing within the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party to move the party at the national level. But you can see that, basically the White House really stepped up after marriage equality made it into the platform in terms of pushing on marriage equality and fighting for it. And ultimately it was the courts who made the decision. But you can see how the platform is so important, because a lot of people don't think that it's very important. But those of us who are fighting on the inside and even on the outside to make sure that we have a platform that actually speaks to where we are as a society, what we believe in as Democrats, what we think is important, actually does make a difference in people's lives and can be used to help push legislation. And we've seen this sort of on the flip side with things that also aren't very good. From my perspective, in 1976, welfare reform was in the platform. And that was something where when we actually passed that under the Clinton administration, I had thought, just as a very young person, but a Democrat, had thought that had come from the Republican Party, and it was just sort of part of the triangulation. But it actually came from the Democrats and was in our 1976 platform, and Jimmy Carter was elected and became our nominee and was elected. So I just say that because it's just very important, if you care about social justice issues, if you care about making change within the Democratic Party, which I'm guessing many of you do, because you're part of this very active club, it is very important to pay attention, to speak out on the platform. I know several years ago, it might have been 2008, I think it was, we actually did video recordings of people asking the platform committee to put specific things into the platform. So I know we had one on homelessness, and we had various members of the community who were experts on those issues speaking directly on video to the platform committee. So there have been some like grassroots activities around this where people have tried to influence the committee and make sure that certain things are put in there. I know that Russell Green 4 years ago, who is a climate activist, many of you may know, worked very hard to put in some very strong climate change language into the platform to make sure that all of those issues were expressed. And that wasn't something that had come from Clinton's campaign, and it was much stronger even than the Sanders campaign had like agreed to or wanted. And so it was just another example of how, you know, activists have been able to sort of get in there and make change, and just make sure that you know, we're getting the backs of people who may not have a voice in the party, or, you know, helping to save our planet. So I think I'll talk a little bit too about some of the rules changes and how this convention is a little different. So many of you may know that after the 2016 convention, there was a Unity Reform Commission that was formed that had both Sanders and Clinton supporters on that commission to get the parties to come together and to make concrete changes so that people would have, you know, continue to have faith in our party. And there were the rules and sort of the system by which, you know, we're governed. And so one of the recommendations was to diminish the power of superdelegates. There was a lot of concern that the media was going to superdelegates and finding out how they would vote, and then showing those votes ahead of time before there was a primary within a certain state, and people felt that it was skewing the vote. Some people felt that it was rigging the vote, and so there were a lot of questions that were asked. And so one of the solutions was to diminish the voting capacity and the power of superdelegates. And superdelegates are, you know, folks like me who get elected by a state Democratic Party. There also are congressional representatives, U.S. senators, the governors. And so all of those folks together, people felt were sort of skewing what would have been just, you know, the democratic vote of the people, was skewing like who would be the nominee, which is something that you don't want to do, right? You want to make sure that the nominee is the person who is, you know, the most popular in all the states, because then when we go to the general election and we're running against the Republican, you want to make sure we have the most powerful candidate that you can possibly have. And so the recommendation that from the Unity Commission got changed a little bit. And so at this convention, superdelegates will not have a vote on the presidential nominee unless we only have one nominee. So the first vote that's taken for the presidential nominee, we will not be able to vote or weigh in on that by expressing our vote. And if there were a second vote to come up, although coming up for this convention, that likely won't happen. But if there were a second vote or a second ballot, then we could vote. So that's a change that has been made. And I think there are lots of us in the party who supported that. I supported that change. I would rather superdelegates just not vote at all, frankly, even on a second ballot, and maybe extend our at-large votes for the candidate instead, and still keep that consistent so that the percentage of people voting for a candidate, you know, represents the same percentage of people who voted for that candidate in the primary. But, you know, we're moving on these reforms. There was also a lot of questions brought up in terms of some of the appointments that were made by the chair of the DNC. So there were some consultants and employees who had worked for presidential candidates who were put on the rules committee, and I think on credentials as well. And so we might want to see some reform there. I mean, typically it won't matter by the time that they're taking up these rules committee changes or credentials, because usually we have a nominee by then. But just in case we don't, it's probably you know, a good idea for us not to be having consultants and employees of campaigns making the rules for the convention, or sitting on the credentials committee making decisions on like how many delegates, you know, from a particular state are seated at our convention. You know, a lot of things like that have come up in the past. And so, you know, just to keep things above board and to make sure people still have faith in the process, you want to make sure that it's very fair and not skewed. And so, you know, we're still working on those things. And I know a lot of people throughout the state of California have ideas that they have brought to me, and I do as much as I can to move forward a lot of things that people bring to me, just to make sure that, you know, I'm representing our state and people's concerns. I do put a lot of resolutions through on various issues. So if there's something that you're concerned about, I'm, you know, happy to take a resolution up and help get it passed at the national level. I've done that on election reform. I've done that on behalf of rural communities and making sure that they're represented, obviously on poverty issues. And these are all things that, again, like, you want to pass resolutions because the resolutions themselves actually help inform the platform as well. So if we can make a case that the DNC is already on record for supporting something, it makes it more likely that we can get that through the platform. So that's sort of, you know, the sort of like what's going on and where we're headed right now. And like I said, it's unclear on how we're going to be having this convention. It will likely be virtual. I mean, I'm a health commissioner for the city of Los Angeles, so I would prefer that it's virtual and not have anyone put at risk for contracting COVID. So we'll see, you know, I mean, but I hear a lot about what's happening maybe a few hours or a day before it hits the press, and sometimes I just find out because it's in the media, like the rest of you. So I will be happy, though, to keep everyone informed on how things are moving and how folks can participate. In addition to that, there are delegates who will be selected to represent presidential candidates. The deadline to file for that is over, and the deadline actually was, I believe, yesterday to put in to vote in that. But so next week, I think it's June 3rd and 4th, people will be able to vote online for who they want to represent them from the specific candidate campaign. So, you know, Bernie Sanders will have his delegates in proportion to his vote within the specific congressional district. And then all of those folks will be able to vote at the upcoming convention. And so that's happening. So if you did get your, if you did sign up for this by yesterday's deadline, you'll be able to vote next week on who will represent you, and you may be running yourself. So, so I think that's about it, and we can move it over to questions.
Susie, thank you so much. We are indeed very fortunate to have such a knowledgeable, committed member of the DNC as you are. And I would just like to reiterate something that impressed me from what you said, and that is that not only do we have to voice our opinions on issues, but we also have to do the hard work and the organizing that goes into making sure that those issues are heard and pushed forward. And doing the hard work and the organizing is not always what people are interested in doing. But we're very thankful that you are interested in doing that. And I will go on to the questions. We have okay, not too smart that I didn't put my camera on. So now my camera is on. Anyway, thank you, Susie. And the first question is that Biden will pick his name, his choice for VP probably at some point. And if you have any insights on that, and is it possible for him to lay out his major cabinet posts also at the time of the convention or ahead of time in an effort to show diversity?
Sure. So I don't know much more than anyone else in terms of what's coming down for a VP pick. I know that there's a short list, and there has been for a while. And one of our U.S. senators from California is on that short list. Elizabeth Warren is on that short list. And then there's, you know, rumors about other folks, Susan Rice and some other folks who across the country. I do know that Biden has said that he will have a woman, that he is going to pick a woman as his VP pick. And so I am waiting anxiously, like the rest of you, to know who that is. I have my own thoughts in terms of like who I think is most likely, but that's all for me, just conjecture. I'm not, no one is sharing with me, or really not a lot is coming out about who that pick is going to be. And I think, again, there's a short list. There's a lot of polling going on. There's a lot of vetting going on. And I think what comes out of the vetting will have a lot to do with who gets ultimately chosen as a VP pick. For the candidates, for the cabinet picks, I don't know that we'll know that before the convention. And sometimes if you do, if you were to do that, it creates more problems, I think, because the media is also reporting on and vetting those candidates. And I think, there would, particularly for cabinet picks, as well as a VP pick, there has to be like background checks and vetting, and they want to know, there's like some opposition research where you try to find out like the things about that person that could come out in the press that could be damaging. And there's a whole process there, and so it's not something where you can just sort of throw out names. And there's a vetting that's done in the press as well, so you might not want to bring all of that press attention onto a lot of this stuff going into the convention. And sometimes not even during the election. A lot of times, or leading up to the election. A lot of times. We know these things like after the election because you don't want it to be part of the talking points or part of negative press and that kind of thing. So it's likely we won't know most of these cabinet appointments that will happen.
Thank you. The next question is, how will the COVID situation affect the poverty platform of the party?
So that is a really good question. Yes, so that is a really good question. That's something that I'm actually working on right now. We have seen, even in the state of California, we have seen that the inequities that that a lot of people already were experiencing have been, really either brought to the forefront and in some cases exacerbated by the COVID-19 situation. I live in Los Angeles County. We have over 50% of our workers are unemployed right now. We have people who cannot pay rent. We have people who cannot make mortgage payments. We have people who own property with renters who can't pay the rent, so they therefore cannot pay their mortgage. And so there has been a lot of talk about first of all, making sure that rents are not raised while people cannot work and we're under emergency orders. There have been movements to cancel rent and mortgage payments. We can see too that for low-income communities, People are disproportionately impacted by COVID. I work with homeless and low-income communities here in Los Angeles. I was out on Skid Row about 3 weeks ago, and when I was out there, I noticed that people were lining up to get food at a mission, and there were no signs. And there were people out there who were navigating folks coming in, but there were no signs for social distancing. There was like no tape outside, like what we've seen here outside of our grocery stores to show people, where that 6 feet limit is, or 6 feet intervals, where they should stand to be safe. Most people did not have masks. And so, and these are folks who are not watching the governor's statements every day. They're not watching the mayor's statements every day on television. They're just out there without understanding what the risks are. We've had, 3 shelters that have come down with COVID outbreaks. And so, that's just to illustrate that there is a lot more work to do, particularly for low-income communities, in terms of making sure that people are safe. And you can see there was an article today in the paper, it actually came out yesterday online, just showing that, rates are still increasing for COVID in low-income communities here in Los Angeles, and they're, we're seeing less of it in higher income communities, and so this is just, it's a domino effect, and we need to make sure that we're addressing all of these issues, and I think that will play a big part in the platform.
Thank you, Susie. It's a very important question. Another question, how can we get information on what issues are being considered by the committees and the caucuses, and who can we contact about an issue and whether or not it is under consideration?
Sure. Okay, so the first indication that we have in terms of what our platform is going to look like is this policy task force that was created to include Biden and Sanders supporters. And those issues are climate change, criminal justice, the economy, education, healthcare, and immigration. And then within the context of those, because I know like where the rubber meets the road is what specifically goes into each one of those, issue areas. How those are mapped out will be based on, how strong the voices are that are coming from the community. So I'm happy to be a conduit to whatever extent I can to the various committees within the task force and then on the platform committee. I don't serve on the platform committee. I mean, we don't know who will be serving on it yet because all of the delegates haven't been chosen yet for the various candidates. But I'm sure that I will be able to have some influence, particularly on poverty issues. I plan to chime in on criminal justice issues, education, healthcare, and I'm hoping that maybe we could do something similar to what we did in 2008, where we're sending in videos or sending in testimony, and the platform committee should meet several times, and so we will have people from California who will serve on that platform committee, who can be our voice. And the time though to start thinking about what you want in there is now, and the time to start writing language that you want to see in there is now. It's not necessarily a great idea to wait until we see what's in the first draft to chime in. I think it's more important to have a say in what goes into the first draft. And that means like if you want to start forming committees now, or if you are an expert on a certain issue or have worked on a certain issue for a long time, making sure that you're writing up language or working with others to write up language, I think is really important. But I can't stress that like things are happening now, and we should be sort of moving forward. On a good note, both the Sanders campaign and the Biden campaign have issued statements about their own candidacies and their own platforms that they're running on. So some of that language will likely get incorporated into our platform at the DNC. Regardless, though, if there is an issue that you are concerned about and that you feel needs to be expressed in the platform, and I hope that I hammered home the importance of that platform in terms of ending up with legislation at the national level eventually. I think to start writing that now is extremely important.
Thank you, Susie. And we have two delegates who were just elected from Orange County, as well as you, to whom we could probably send information, and that would be Ada Briseño, who's the chair of the DPOC, and Melahat Rafi, who was a former executive director of the DPOC. So
Yep.
I will make sure that we get that information out to our members so that they know how to whom they can address concerns. And the next question I think you actually answered, and that was that is it correct that the DNC 2016 platform is the current draft platform for 2020? And the question went on that, what's the process to do amendments and offer resolutions? You basically answered that, but perhaps you have something additional to add.
Yeah, so the 2016 platform will not be the 2020 platform, but it's a jumping off point. So in other words, we don't want to sort of renegotiate what we already negotiated in 2016, so we don't want to go backwards, but we do want to strengthen it. So it won't be the same. I mean, I have done sort of a historical analysis of these platforms, and they are radically different from, every 4 years, depending on who the presidential nominee is. And so just as we saw for 1948 and desegregation of the military, things come up within the context of the platform that are happening within our society. So I'm guessing that there will be like a very strong criminal justice platform would be my guess. Something very strong on healthcare. A lot of these issues are coming up in the debate. So a lot on the economy, particularly in the context of what's happening with people not being able to work or to pay their rent or mortgage. That people are feeling very vulnerable right now. There's a lot of food insecurity, a lot of long lines, at our food banks. So a lot of that will inform the platform. But I think it's a good idea to read the 2016 platform, but I'm guessing that will be greatly strengthened.
Thank you very much. And another question is there a racial equality tenant in the DNC platform? And if so, how is it worded and does it need to be strengthened? But again, this is in the potential 2020, I guess.
Yeah. So the answer is yes and yes. Yes, there is, and yes, it needs to be strengthened. And I think, as we're watching, parts of Minneapolis burn down, and a lot of what's going on, particularly with, respect to police abuse and a lot of things that have been happening really over hundreds of years, but really, like even over the last week or two, we need to strengthen that clearly. I mean, given, Trump's response last night to what was happening in Minneapolis was just outrageous. What he put out on Twitter. And I think that our responsibility really leading into the general election is to show the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And in order to do that, we need to be responsive And in order to be responsive, we need to have a much stronger plank on racial equality and all of those issues. So I am guessing, the 2016 platform, you can literally Google it and see what was in 2016, but I would be an advocate for very strongly changing that to strengthen it.
Thank you, Susie. Might have time for one or two more questions. Another question is how you feel about whether delegates can vote for another candidate other than the one who won the state.
Oh, sure. So I really believe that the vote of the DNC members needs to be in proportion to the vote of the state. So you never want to take those scales and give more weight to the candidate that doesn't have the most delegates, if that makes sense. I mean, that is the democratic way to do it. That is a way to make sure that California is represented based on the vote in the primary, and not just because somebody, thinks that they want something. The real way to do that, though, is to just end the superdelegate voting system and to allow a lot of the folks who, are superdelegates and others who would come in to just be at-large delegates for the presidential candidate in proportion to the vote of the state. And that way you ensure that the vote of the state is actually in the same proportion as the delegates who are voting for the presidential candidate. And that is the way to ensure that you have the strongest candidate going into November, taking on the Republican candidate. So yes, I am. I think that there needs to be a little more reform, though, at the DNC to ensure that that happens.
Okay, thank you. Personally, I would not like to see us lose you as a delegate, though, and some of the other people that I know who are super delegates.
And I would, so we would in that system.
No, I understand.
I would still be a representative from California, would still be there. It's just a question of how we vote on the presidential candidate. And in that case, I could, if I were like one of the presidential candidates at large appointees, but otherwise I wouldn't be able to. And that's kind of how it should be.
Okay, thank you. No, I understand. I'm just a believer in the people who know about history and who have done the work as you have, having a voice. Anyway, okay. Last question, I think. What happened in the 25th congressional district special election? Although we know the results, but how do we stop it from happening again in November and from happening in other places?
Organizing. I mean, it takes organizing, it takes money, it takes, all of these things. I mean, we're particularly in a lot of these districts where it's very, it can be very close in terms of the vote, even in places where the registration isn't that close, sometimes the vote is very close. And I don't know like what the magic formula is, but yeah, it just more organizing, more money to get the word out, because really, what it always comes down to is whoever has the most voters that comes out. I think we have a good chance in November for the 25th, just because not as many people will come out in the primary, and typically it skews a little more conservative in the primary than it does in the general. So I'm hoping that that's the case, but I'm an organizer at heart, and I've worked as an organizer for a very long time, and more organizing and more people helping would be great. Making calls. I mean, obviously we can't really canvass right now. But yeah, anything that you can do to help would be great.
Thank you, Susie, but we will start phone banking soon, even though we can't canvass. And that is all that we have time for today, unfortunately. I'm sure people have lots more questions, and we thank you very much for your time. And I really can't thank you enough for all that you do for all of us, because what you do to lift up people in poverty helps everybody. And that's the bottom line for the Democratic Party. And that's what we need to remember, that what we do for each and every one of us, what we do for somebody else helps each and every one of us in the long run. And we thank you so much for your service to Los Angeles and to the Democratic Party and to all of us.